back to the Scarlet Faithful podcast, talking Rutgers football. Very busy in the transfer portal again these past few days. David Anderson is back to talk about what it all means for the roster for the 2025 season. Want to start off, we're going to look at the 10 transfers that have come in so far. First, starting with offense, 4 players that Rutgers has signed on the offensive side of the ball. Of course, C.J. Campbell Jr., the running back, dynamic running back from Florida Atlantic. Wide receiver D.T. Sheffield from North Texas. Had a big year last year statistically. The tight end Colin Weber from Charlotte. And also offensive lineman and brother of Gus Zelinkis, Hank Zelinkis, a starter at Colorado this past season. David, thanks so much for being here on the offensive side. Break it down however you'd like, but what are your initial thoughts on these 4 offensive players that Rutgers has brought in through the portal so far?
Overall, and I know the only one that we've really talked about on this podcast is Campbell in any sort of depth. The other ones were kind of hinted at. My overall point on everything is just I think this gives you more options at your disposal as an offense. I think that's the biggest takeaway. You have most of your offense back intact. What you're trying to do is you're trying to give yourself more flexibility that if you got to throw the ball more, if you got to throw the ball more to your tight end, if you have to, run different types of offense, especially as you're facing better opponents. I think that overall, that's what this group does. I think that they needed to add more speed. I mean, we saw in the bowl game what Kansas State was able to do just by having speed on their offense. Adding Campbell and Sheffield does that. And then obviously it's almost impossible to replace Holland Pierce. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to replace him in the aggregate with guys who are improving that are already on your roster. Anyone else who can help in those areas, whether it be a tight end, improving the blocking as that position, or just adding another guy who can block on the interior line that can kind of offset or take the pressure off of your outside guys a little bit more if possible. I think that's the general theme of how I feel about these offensive guys that they've added. It's really just, it's not necessarily just going to replace anything that's already on the roster, but it's more just giving you more options at your disposal in case you need to use them in the 2025 season.
Yeah, and I think we both agree, the offense has a lot coming back. Obviously, they have lost Monungai, Pierce, most notably, Demir Miller as well. But just in terms of who they've added, I mean, Campbell, being a pass catcher out of the backfield could give them an element they haven't had previously. DT Sheffield seems like maybe a more athletic, dynamic Demir Miller type that could play in the slot. Obviously, Weber, they need help at tight end. He's a proven tight end, 2-year starter at Charlotte, averages a career over 10 yards per catch, had 21 catches last year, 34 the year before. Hasn't scored a touchdown, but, is pretty reliable and has been a solid blocker there in his career. And then obviously you're bringing in a guy that started at center before for a P4 team at Colorado and Hank Zelinkis. So I think in terms of where they were at going into the portal season and what they've done so far, it gives real hope that it can help elevate this offense moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I guess let's talk about the offensive line because that's obviously the area where they might be looking to add the more if they can. It sounds great in theory, right? We need to add a tackle, just like we hear we need to add an edge rusher, or we need to add a center in basketball, or we need to add a left-handed reliever in baseball, whatever it is. It's easier said than done. And so obviously you have the connection there with Gus, his brother, playing, and Hank seems to me like he might be a higher upside guy, which makes sense based on his high school recruiting rankings. And he just seems like he's a little bigger. I mean, when I watch Hank, there's actually a good breakdown by a guy called like David Loves Buffs or something. It's not me. It's some other Colorado Buffaloes fan who had 2 videos talking about Hank Zelinkis and what he was doing well, what he was not doing well early last year before he ultimately fell out of favor with the staff. I think that he clearly needs to add more strength. And when he does get into trouble, it's because he's kind of like leaning forward. I know for anyone who's listening on the audio, they can't see me, but like sometimes he's just kind of caught leaning forward, bending at the waist at times. And I don't know if that's a product of his arm length The other thing is sometimes he gets his feet a little bit too wide, and he offsets that by then like moving them fast. But he has proven to be effective in both run and pass protection. And so I think that, one of the things that his brother Gus struggled with at center was at times just these really, really big hulking linemen. And I think that Hank is a guy who, if he does reach his potential at Rutgers, he might just have a slightly bigger frame to handle those type of guys in the future. Do I think he's going to unseat his brother as starting center this year? Probably not, unless they decide to move one of them to guard or something. But I really see him more. He's going to probably be your backup center this year, and unless they feel really good about someone like John Stone, and then next year likely you're going to lose Felter, you're going to lose Gus Zielinskis in the interior, and you're going to be looking for other starters. And I think that he would definitely be able to fill that role. I see some of his downsides. Like I said, sometimes he gets his feet too wide, sometimes his bend's a little off, but he does seem to know how to play offensive line when it comes to helping, getting to the second level, and when it comes to like not just running to the second level and opening up a gap where someone can penetrate the backfield. So I think he has a lot of the skills you want to see in the center. So a little bit more physical development, and he could be just as good, potentially even better than his brother. So I think that, yeah, this isn't necessarily a cool position of need, but you've got to just continue to add linemen when you can, because even, for example, they got Shedrick Rhodes last year from Ohio, and I don't know if they're going to be able to get guys too much better than that in the portal this year, but maybe with Holland Pierce moving on, someone's going to have to step up in those roles. And even if it's not, this year, because there are some guys who might still have been on the bench that could contribute. Like we saw them stabilize their line as the year went on, and I think Hank is a good addition. Although I'm sure they'd like to add more in the portal if they can. It's just obviously offensive linemen come at a high price.
Right. Very good point, just in terms of value. But I think the fact that they're getting someone that, he's a little bit more of a proven commodity, both in terms of they know his strengths and weaknesses, and they know he, has competed at the P4 level,
Right.
just kind of gives, I think, a little bit more of insight and makes more sense in terms of you can add P4 linemen, even if they have struggled at times. You know what you're dealing with. You know what they can kind of fit into what you're looking for in terms of your own system. Just in terms of eligibility, I should mention, as you did with Zielinskis, he does have 2 years of eligibility remaining. The other three offensive players all are in their last year of eligibility. Campbell Jr. from Florida Atlantic. Sheffield at North Texas, he had 66 catches for almost 900 yards last year, and over 800 yards and 11 touchdowns. Has a lot of speed. Just your initial thoughts on him in terms of how he could fit potentially into the passing game.
Yeah, I don't think he does as many different things as Dymere Miller can do from a receiving standpoint. I think his route tree is a little shorter. A lot of the plays that he got were kind of like you put him in motion, you throw a quick pass, or even you just hand it to him, or just simple routes where you're just trying to say, hey, go to a spot, we'll throw the ball if you're open, and then try to go for extra yardage. His catch radius is not that big. He's not tall, and like sometimes people just assume, hey, Brandon Coleman's got a big catch radius because he was 6'6" back when he was at Rutgers. He, for his height, did not. One of my concerns with Sheffield is even for his height, I don't think he has a very big catch radius. I think that most of the balls he catches are like in his body with no defender on him. So one of my concerns is if defenders can just be all over him, that he might not have space to kind of secure a lot of those passes. So it's going to be on the coaching staff to ensure that they put him in positions where he's not overexposed in this particular area, but it also gives you an opportunity to not play him on every down. And so if they can find other guys who might be able to play, in a rotation in the two deep, and he doesn't have to play every snap, you can be more selective with what plays go in with him. I think the staff kind of fell into a trap this year where they were playing Dymere Miller every snap, or especially earlier in the year. And then you're like, well, we have Christian Dremel. We should be using him. And so it's unfortunate that they don't have Dremel because I think he and Sheffield would be a nice tandem. But they're gonna have to find someone else to get some of those reps. And I do think he brings enough speed that the defenses will have to be worried about it. I think a lot of times we saw them just leave Dymere Miller in single coverage figuring, yeah, he might break one tackle, but we'll have time for the cavalry to arrive, especially when he would run those kind of out and ups where we saw Ethan Kaliakmanis struggle to throw out routes. But if the receiver goes out to the sideline, then comes up the sideline, we saw Miller have that success against Virginia Tech as well as a couple other of those midseason games. I think if you get Sheffield on one of those, he's gone. Like, I think he has enough speed that if the defender's trailing him, he's going to be gone. And so I do think that there he's not a perfect prospect, but he clearly can add an element to this offense that they did not have this past year. And especially when you're relying on two bigger possession receivers and Strong and Duff on the outside, trying to have a guy who does the complete opposite skills is really what you need. You don't need guys with bigger catch radiuses. They have that. What they're trying to do is find guys to fill other niches on the roster. And I think this was a good add from that standpoint.
And I think too, it's also complementary to Campbell, who can catch out of the backfield, who can kind of, I don't want to say split the passes to Miller, but gives them another dynamic that if Sheffield can do what he does well, that could be enough. And also, I think trickability. He had a 75-yard touchdown on a trick play for North Texas against Memphis. Rutgers, didn't really attempt that at all last year. And maybe that was personnel related. Maybe it was just, mentality, conservative, whatever. But he obviously gives them a potential there to be a little more creative in how they utilize him. And as you mentioned, with the smaller catch radius, if they can kind of get him on an end around or something like that, and just get him out in open space, that's something that could be a real weapon for them. Weber brings a lot of size, 6'4", 260. Charlotte, it plays in a solid competition. He's certainly bigger than someone like Kenny Fletcher and pretty much anyone other than Victor Konopka that's listed as a tight end. I guess, how do you view him in terms of an addition for this offense? And do you think he's, in line to be that starter?
I think that they want to at least use two tight ends, and that doesn't necessarily mean always on the same play. So let's take an example, like you were saying. Let's say you have Sheffield going in motion to the left side, and you got Campbell in the backfield, right? As a defense, if Sheffield's going this way, and you see the safeties are starting to cheat towards that side, well, then that's one less guy if you hand it to Campbell going to the right or throw a screen to him or something like that. But for that to work, you really need at least a tight end to assist your linemen so you have 6 blockers. It really doesn't work unless you run the air raid, that you're only blocking with 5 most of the time. You either have to run an air raid or you have to have a quarterback who's so fast that he can just run around the outside. And so what I think they are looking for in Weber is I don't think he's as big as Giovanni Haskins, but the most success that they had in the Schiano 2.0 era is when they had a tight end who was good enough at blocking that unless the guy is a premier defensive end, that you can trust that he can at least hold him up for you to execute like a screen pass or a jet sweep where he doesn't have to hold the guy forever, but he just has to slow the defensive end enough that you can get this play to work. And I think that was something they were lacking this past season, even when Fletcher was healthy, because that's just not what he does. Basically, they had to go to Tyler Needham in the end of the year as a blocking tight end in the bowl game and the finale against Michigan State to basically be like, well, if we don't have a tight end can do it, might as well put 6 linemen out there. And then with Fletcher, what they did was they were like, well, the threat of him having to receive a pass, we're relying on that to hold up the defensive end. So what I like is that Weber brings a different approach than Fletcher, that a defense can't just go into with the game plan of like, hey, whichever side the tight end's on, we're going to play it this way, as in we're either going to play him as a receiver or we're going to assume he's blocking. This gives you the opportunity that when you rotate in and out of personnel, that it makes it harder for the defensive coaches to know how you're going to utilize your tight end, and that thus is going to make them more effective. Because either you're going to have to allot extra guys to defend a tight end, or if you don't do that, then he's going to have opportunities to leak out of the backfield or just block guys, or there might be guys standing in no man's land because they're waiting for a route from Kenny Fletcher, but you've got Weber in there, and then he can help block with his tackle, right? Like offset the loss of Holland Pierce. So again, I think it gives you a lot more options. I don't think he's an elite blocker. I don't think he's an elite receiver. But I think he does enough that when you have Kenny Fletcher over here who's very fast, and shows something in the receiving game, he can serve as a complement in that way. Again, I don't think he's going to catch a lot of passes, but the passes he can catch should be pretty impactful. And I think they're going to be able to put some plays in the playbook that, hey, we need a 3rd and 5, and he's probably going to come out open on that play because they're saving it for those moments. That's kind of how I see it. Like Illinois used with, I think, Arkin this past year. He didn't have that many catches, but when he did make catches, they were pretty impactful. And I think that's what's going to happen with Weber because of a role he's going to be able to fill that they don't have someone on the roster to currently do. I think Blake, Higgins, they're more of that Fletcher type. That he's more of like a combo tight end who's blocking and receiving guy.
Yeah, great points. And just in terms of the last edition, we've talked about Campbell before, but I think, whether he's kind of platoons with Raymond, and obviously you have, Gruyere, Winovich, and Benjamin back in the stable as well. Or I think, obviously with Campbell's pass catchability, you can see him a lot on 3rd downs as well. I guess, what are your hopes for him based on the film you've watched of him and kind of how you think Shiraka could best utilize him?
Well, first of all, he's not going to be an every down back. He wasn't even an every down back at FAU. One of the things when you look at film of a guy like this is other guys on his team were having success at running back in addition to him. And so that with the run game, as a receiver, he was the one receiving a lot more of the passes. So that makes you wonder, on one hand, is it just a product of his blocking? Like, is that why everyone's doing well? Or is it just because they have other guys? And the more I watched the film, the more I kind of felt like they had other guys and they were being very strategic with saving him as a home run hitter. And so I expect at minimum, him and Raymond would split snaps. I wouldn't even call it split carries because I think Raymond or just some other guys might get more carries. But in terms of snaps, I think that's where it is. As a blocker, he has the size, and he's 200 pounds. He's very similar to Monungai in his size, about 5'9", 5'10", a little over 200 pounds. He could be a pass blocker, but at the end of the day, do you really want him to be a pass blocker, or is he going to be more of a threat at the backfield? And so I think it'll be interesting how they do utilize him. But again, I think Benjamin is quicker than he is fast. They don't really have a really fast guy in that backfield that you feel like a Breece Hall is going to just break it for 75 yards if he gets free. And that's really where we haven't seen Rutgers have very many of those guys since I've been watching the team. I mean, even the good ones that they've had, the Ray Rice, the Jawan Jamesons, they could get caught from behind, even Kyle Monungai, right? And so what I'm hoping is this is a guy that adds enough of a threat that the only one I can really think of is Pacheco, that, the defense has to account for him just because of his pure end-to-end speed. And so hopefully, again, Kirk Shiraka, congratulations on the contract extension. This is going to be on him to figure out how do I set up a defense that he's going to be able to run past one guy and then go the distance. So I think that's what the biggest takeaway is. I would have been okay with the lineup that they're going to go into it next year, but this is another level that I don't know if they have. Maybe one of the true freshmen, but this also, I think, takes more pressure off Sheffield because I think you could also use Campbell in some of these like screens or even jet sweeps because you have some of these other running backs, and the defense isn't going to see him go in motion and say, oh, it's definitely going to him, because they're going to have to respect the other things you have on your offense.
Yeah, great points. It should note that, as the season went on, Campbell got more and more carries. The last 5 games, 6 of the last 7, he had 15 or more carries. And also just in terms of, his 2 years at Florida State, he did have a 70-yard touchdown run there. So, he does have that big hit ability in the run game, not just in the pass game too. But I agree. I like him as a kind of a combo with Sheffield in terms of having him on the field at the same time. It'll be interesting to see how they utilize him. overall, I think the offense has done a pretty good job. You mentioned previously maybe offensive line is still on the table in terms of adding anything else. I guess, are you surprised, or what do you expect before the spring semester starts in spring camp, just in terms of if the offense will do anything more?
I mean, I don't cover this as closely as some of the guys at, for example, Night Report or 247, but I think if they can find any more offensive linemen that they are going to try, it never hurts to try that. If you can get guys who you think can play. On other the skill positions, again, if they can add someone who's like a game breaker, I think they will, but their resources have to be tied up in either offensive tackle or anything else on defense. I think really that's got to be more of their focus as they go through this spring semester. If a guy like pops, like even Hank Zielinskis, like you have the connection, his brother's on the team, that's a logical fit. But unless it's like a game-changing guy, I really think they need to focus their time, energy, and even potential NIL, again, not just money, but literally their time and building relationships on the defensive side of the ball, if possible. So I don't expect much more on the offense. I mean, you can only see a quarterback too if you think that this guy was maybe in a situation where he didn't shine. But I wouldn't say they're going to like proactively. It doesn't make sense to just completely shake up the room just to cause turmoil in the quarterback room.
Yeah, and with Shepard and Serace back, and Serace obviously coming off that injury, and then Cali Manis, I wouldn't expect that. But you're right, you can never rule it out. And that's a good segue going to defense. And I think another point to mention, just in terms of perspective, with all the transfers they're adding, I think they've done a really good job of adding proven guys at their level.
Right.
There's a little bit less kind of unpredictability there, but I think on offense, you got guys that have been at a certain level that I think on film you could see translate to the offense. Now going into defense, but before I go there, just talking about revenue sharing, I think that's been a big aspect of this too. Obviously, it's not final. Obviously, it's not approved yet, but I think that has allowed Rutgers to go out and get some more proven guys in the portal so far. Something to watch for. And then on the defensive end, they've gotten four players on the defensive line. We know the defensive line needs a lot of help. 2 in the secondary. Let's start at defensive end. Eric O'Neill from James Madison initially started his career at LIU, and then Bradley Weaver from Ohio. Obviously, generating a pass rush on a consistent basis is a huge need for this team. I'll let you go first, just in terms of your initial thoughts on them, and then I'll chime in after.
Yeah, so O'Neill, I don't think that he's a surefire every down starter for a couple reasons. One, I just don't think he's that big. And we saw for Kansas State, they were, hyping up this edge rusher they had. I think his name was Mott. And what did he do in the bowl game against Rutgers? Yeah, 1 tackle. That's it. Yeah. And so I think that with defensive end, maybe more than any other position, like the size of the guys that you're going against just is really, really a factor. I mean, when I look at O'Neill, he had good production. But the one thing that makes me hesitate a little bit is offenses were at times blocking him with the tight end. Not double teaming him, but literally blocking him with the tight end. Now, part of it is you can line him up so that he's going against a tight end and he can kind of be outside of like a tackle. So, yes, there are things you can do as a defensive coach to say, hey, I don't want this smaller guy going head up against, even, like I said, in that Kansas State example, going head up against Holland Pierce or Taj White, and he wasn't having a success, right? Yeah. So that I think was partially on the Kansas State coaching staff to fail. Like hopefully whoever Rutgers hires as their new DC in tandem with the defensive line coaches can say, this is how we're going to utilize this guy. People talk about his motor. I think he at times shows a good motor. At other times, I think that he's more than willing to just kind of like absorb a double team and get like pushed off of his spot. I like the passion and energy. I mean, we talk about like with the nastiness you have to have an offensive line. On defensive line, you have to have this mentality of like, I'm the man. Like that kind of matters in terms of like this machismo at times. And I think he brings like those intangibles. My concern is more just like if a Big Ten lineman, let's say it's Holland Pierce, because obviously our Rutgers fans are familiar with him. If Holland Pierce gets a hand like inside of his body, I'm not sure if he's going to be able to get free. Now, Holland Pierce is one of the better tackles in the Big Ten, right? He was all Ping-Dead guy. But that's my concern with O'Neal is like, is he going to be able to be effective against these better tackles? I think against weaker competition, he's going to eat them up. And kind of like talking about getting off to a fast start against, teams in the MAC, like I think he's going to be effective in those games, and I think it might help build momentum for this team. But I don't see him as an every down, especially against the run, especially if he has to hold his gap. That's just not what he brings. He's going to have to be used selectively, and then hopefully by doing so, he can hold up for a full season rather than breaking down from taking that constant punishment. So, I mean, I like the ad. They need ads. I never am going to say don't add a scholarship defensive lineman who has proven track record, especially. But I don't think he's going to get 10 sacks. I mean, maybe 5 or 6 if I had to guess. Like, I think they're going to have to be strategic with how they use him. And I guess I'm just not sold that he's going to be a full-time 3-down Big Ten defensive end.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, size in this case is really important. And also just in terms of, the talent level, he was able to excel. I mean, he did start his career at LIU. But I think an important context in looking at this is not just what he individually brings, but what he's replacing. And is it a clear upgrade from what Rutgers is losing? And someone like Aaron Lewis, who's a couple inches taller, O'Neal's just listed at 250. Obviously, he's going to add some weight. Lewis was listed at 267, but I think he was actually a little bit bigger than that. So I think, is he an upgrade from Aaron Lewis? And I have a hard time looking at it right now and saying he is. And I know people were kind of, disappointed or frustrated with how Aaron Lewis kind of ended up in his career. But I also think there's a lot of factors there that, don't show up on the stat sheet that he brought to the defense, just in terms of, getting doubled by opposing offensive linemen. Some of the things he battled through in his career, he still was he was very reliable, and he did make some impact plays even at the end of the season when he clearly wasn't fully healthy.
Right.
I just think, his pedigree, his recruiting background, being at Michigan, I mean, that talent level, he never had a 10-sack season, but I think he meant a lot to this defense. And I think whoever you're adding, you have to look at what they're replacing. And I think O'Neal is useful, potentially useful, and I think will play a role for sure. But yeah, I think to say that, it's a clear upgrade or a guarantee that it's a home run ad at this point it doesn't look like it to me. We could be proven wrong, but it's also too early to tell, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think O'Neal is more the one who you expect to replace the Wesley Bailey side of things on that end, because
All right, so
I would think that, you kind of, even if you're not playing a 3-4, even if you're playing a 4-3, one of your ends is probably going to be your bigger, stronger guy who plays on the strong side. And I think that's probably more likely to be Bradley Weaver. But my thing with Eric O'Neal is like, I don't know if he's going to need other guys to kind of push the pocket, because what he shows you is that, let's say someone else can force the quarterback to have to step up. He has the quickness that he can disengage the guy blocking him and then chase down the quarterback before he gets into open field. We saw Rutgers struggle with that, especially in the midseason, where like they'd flush a quarterback out of the pocket and he's running for 40 yards. So you got to stop him before he gets going. And I think that's where Eric O'Neal, if you talk about his motor, again, I think it's good. And I think the question is it good enough that he's going to be able to snap up that quarterback before he gets loose, not only to get the sack, but even if it's not a sack, but like it's only a gain of 1 instead of a gain of 40, or on third down, if you're only rushing with 4, is he enough to then not have to run a spy in case the quarterback runs? I mean, how many times this year do we see on 3rd and 8 and Rutgers rushes 4, and then they have to keep a linebacker there because they don't trust that their defensive line can get the quarterback if he tries to run, right? So that's where I think there might be some hidden value there, even if it doesn't show up in the stat sheet. But yes, on a man-on-man, do I think he's a better physical athlete than, let's say, a healthy Wesley Bailey? No. But can he put up more production than Wesley Bailey did in the last 2 years? Absolutely. I mean, moving to the other side, I think Weaver's skill set is more of what you're trying to replace Aaron Lewis. Like his job is going to be use his wrestling background, occupy blockers, hold his lane assignment. I mean, one of the things that Rutgers struggled with during that losing streak was just guys flying through the line, through the backfield, even, like Garbers from UCLA. And so I think that Weaver, he has a good job using leverage. He doesn't have the acceleration, let's say, of Eric O'Neill, but Bradley Weaver, from his wrestling background, it's kind of like a martial artist, right? He knows how to just push a guy real quickly, even if he's not like breaking loose, but he's just controlling his space is what you're trying to do as a defensive lineman, right? I don't think he's going to just like blow tackles backward that often, but I think that he can surprise them from once in a while. And I think that just being a solid defensive end against the run is an underrated skill that sometimes was lacking. And I think let's take a Walker, for example, Jordan Walker, right? By not having played as much football, he was able to pass rush a little bit. Like when you're a new pass rusher, like that's easier to pick up than it is to like know how to play your angles and like leverage so that your gap is filled. And I think that's what Weaver does really, really well on the film. And I don't think he's going to put up a lot of stats at all. But I do think he's going to be able to do what Aaron Lewis was often asked to do in that role, which is like occupy a double team, do not let anyone run through your gap, and don't let the lineman that's get to the second level. And I think Weaver's going to be able to do that. I don't see him as like a pass rusher. So, I mean, you can think of it like more if Weaver and O'Neill are like one guy, I think that their aggregate skill set is enough to be a Big Ten starter. So, if you can get enough production on the other side, whether it's, Jordan Thompson and Weaver as your main run defensive lineman, and then O'Neill and Walker maybe as your guys on pass, maybe that's enough if you can get a little bit of pressure either up the middle or from your linebackers. So I like the ad again. I think he had good production. You say he had production at his level, and they were not blocking him with tight ends usually. And if they did,
Right.
he would just kind of push him out of the way. And so I think that not like the offense are going to have to game plan for him, but they can't just cheat and like leave him unblocked or try to use like a smaller like scat back to block him. That's not going to work. And I think that's something that Rutgers was lacking at times this year, which will hopefully free up the back seven if these guys can at least win their one-on-one matchups or at least control them. That's really where I see this tandem of O'Neill and Weaver. I don't think you can just like, we're going to lock these two guys in as defensive end starters. But in aggregate, like, can you replace the production you got at defensive end in aggregate?
Yeah.
I think you can. I think that they will match what it was this year, but I don't think they're going to match what Rutgers had in 2023 at this moment when they were able to get a little bit more out of their defensive end position.
Well, and I think part of it too is the impact and health of Mo Toure and how they utilize him. If they are able to kind of go back to using him on the edge some too to supplement some of that, I think that will obviously help guys like Weaver and O'Neill as well. Just talking about the size in terms of O'Neill versus Bailey. To your point, Bailey also very similar to Aaron Lewis, 6'5", 265. Weaver's a lot closer to that, 6'4", 262. So more in line in terms of that size, just from a Big Ten perspective. Like you mentioned, going up against Big Ten lines, Big Ten tackles, I think it's extremely relevant to look at that. And, in terms of what they're going to have to go up against 300-pound tackles in the Big Ten that are 6'5", 6'6". I mean, Holland Pierce was 6'8". So all of that's going to factor in. Let's move now to the defensive tackles inside. Doug Blue, Eli from South Florida, and Daryl Denogi from James Madison. Should know Eli has 1 year left, just like Weaver and O'Neill. Denogi from James Madison is younger, has 3 years left, a little bit more raw.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about these on the podcast with Campbell, but I have seen a little bit more of their film. My overall concern is just if you don't have defensive ends who are pushing the pocket, that has to come from somewhere. And I'm not sure if that's what these guys bring. I think they bring enough depth that, especially what we saw happen in the transfer portal, Rutgers losing the Lumen brothers, Bethea, and I think like Jasir Peterson, like a lot of these guys who were your heir apparents to say in terms of the interior,
Yeah,
like they're not there. You have to replace them with someone. And expecting your true freshman, I think Rutgers has two really good true freshmen. Obviously, I've been very high on them from the get go. If you look back at our podcast from last summer, but they're still 18-year-olds versus even a 20 or 21-year-old who has 2 or 3 years of eligibility, or like a 23-year-old on the defensive tackle. So I like them as rotational pieces. I don't think they're going to initially like collapse the pocket, but I think Rutgers is accumulating enough guys that what Schiano really did a good job of figuring out earlier in his tenure was he kind of went small across the board early on and realized, hey, that speed is great if you're Miami, but we kind of need to, again, in aggregate, have a certain amount of size on our team and a certain amount of speed. So by at least kind of making sure your defensive line should not get pushed around in the run game, even if they're not adding a lot of pass rush, like we saw that it was enough later in the year that, occasionally Kayshawn Griffin would get loose, even though that's not what he does best. But it's because you give your defensive backs enough time to cover with 7 guys or not have to quickly fill running lanes in the center of the field. And I think that that's what Rutgers is trying to do here, especially when you're going to play a lot of these big boys. Like, I know Ohio State likes to throw the ball, but if you can't stop their interior run, nothing else is going to matter. And so
right.
doubling down and making sure you have that beef inside. One of the best things I would tell our viewers and listeners to look at is Daniel Jeremiah dug up a list of what traits Bill Belichick looked in players in 1990. So this was many years ago, and he still follows the same philosophy today. That is Belichick, which is you cannot compromise in your defensive line's ability to stop the run on the inside, because if they can't, it doesn't matter whatever else you can do. And so I think Shiano's kind of taking a page out of that, which is like, we're going to have some big, beefy guys in there. And even Rutgers saw this against Akron earlier in the year. When they just loaded up big guys, Rutgers was having trouble running inside early in that game. And so if you can at least make sure that you're forcing them to go outside, it frees up your back guys to do more and roam the field and not have to worry about getting smashed by like pulling guards and centers through the line and, keeping those guys off of your linebackers. So I think overall, again, I haven't addressed either player individually that much because we talked about them already, but I think the philosophy is correct that you got to just, hey, we're going to stop the run up front, and then, hey, if teams can pass on us, we'll try to cross that bridge if we come to it. But I think the philosophy is right. And losing all those younger guys that you had in your, pipeline, you got to replace them with somebody.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can rely on true freshmen. Like I said, the only true freshman that's ever played defensive tackle that I remember was Darius Hamilton, and he was the number 1 player in the state.
Yeah.
So you can't expect literally anything out of defensive tackles as freshmen. So I think this is what they had to do, and I think it's more of a plugging hole than like raising the ceiling of your defense per se.
Yeah, just to be consistent, just in terms of size, Eli and Denoye match up pretty closely to Malcolm Ray, who they're losing. 6'2", 290-ish, although Ray looked a little bit more than 290, I think, at the end of the season.
Yeah.
But then in terms of Keontae Hamilton, Kayshawn Griffin, they're both 6'4", 300 plus. So that'll
Right.
be interesting just in terms of if they beef up a little bit now that they're going to be at Rutgers, and see where they're, pigeonholed in terms of where they want them, either as nose tackle or not on the inside. So we'll see there. Let's move to the last 2 players that are added to the defense in the secondary. Both really intriguing. Jacoby Henderson, 2 years left, the cornerback from Marshall, and then who I think is the best add on the defensive side so far, Jet Elad, the safety from UNLV.
Yeah, I mean, first, I think that Mike Broadbent mentioned this bizarre situation at Marshall that they had with not retaining their coach and then losing so many of their players. So this isn't a circumstance where he didn't have options. I mean, I think Henderson, you got to add a corner, especially when the staff has done a good job. I mean, they got bad luck when it came to Patrice Rene, who was injured really his 1 year at Rutgers after transferring from North Carolina. But
Yeah.
pretty much everyone else who's coming at corner has at least met the expectations that we had. Sure, you could say like Charles Amonkwa. I mean, he was a borderline starter on a group of 5 team, so I didn't expect him to like kind of step in. But everybody else has kind of done what we expected and more. And losing 2 corners, again, I'm not saying man on man that Jacoby Henderson is a better player than Eric Rogers or Robert Longerbeam at this moment. But does having another guy with experience who's got some speed help your defense? Yes. I think like I'm talking about replacing guys in aggregate, even if he is not as fast as, let's say, Robert Longer, or I'm sorry, even if he's not as good of a player as Eric Rogers or Robert Longerbeam, if the defensive line can hold up a little better and you're not relying on him in run support or to make as many tackles, just having a guy who's fast and healthy, assuming he can stay healthy, is something they absolutely need in the cornerback room. I mean, we saw Salam get better as the season went on, but if you were to go into this season with Salam and Masco as your just starting cornerbacks, that is kind of a danger zone, I would say. And so you have to trust this staff's defensive back acumen. They've proven time and time again, even going back to the first tenure, that sure, some years your defensive backfield becomes a sieve, like they were this past year. And you have every single time they were able to come back the next year with a resurgent group. And I think that, yeah, Henderson is a part of that. Do I think that he's, again, is he just a 1-for-1 replacement for Robert Longerbeam? No. But I think that he can be a contributor in the pass game, and add some more speed that you need on this team. And clearly that's what they prioritize with him and Elad. Did you want to say anything else about Henderson before I just talk about Elad?
Yeah, I think it's encouraging at least. He played in the Sun Belt. He was top 5 in terms of pass breakups. Also, 2 of his better games were against their best competition, James Madison. Yeah. He had a career best 8 tackles, and against Appalachian State, 6 tackles and a pick. So, he made an impact in their biggest games this season, and overall he's pretty consistent. He's played a lot in his 2 years. He started every game for them last year as a redshirt sophomore. So I think he brings some experience. Obviously, Big Ten, huge difference, speed, all that. But I think you're right. I think, he certainly adds depth, and I think he'll certainly be on the field. Can he be the every down starter remains to be seen, but I think it's a solid add.
Oh, for sure. And again, you can never have too many cornerbacks. Have you ever heard of a team saying they had too many cornerbacks? It's the same as defensive line. Like, you'll play. I mean, you need gunners on special teams. You need kickoff cover guys. Like, anyone who's good is going to get on the field. And you can even play dime packages with 4 corners if you literally had that many. So, I'm super pleased with it. I mean, I could even see them adding another corner. That might be on the table as well. But I really like the add of Henderson. And then Jet Elad is more of the same of what you said. A guy who's played a lot of football, maybe a little undersized as the reason why he's not going to, let's say, Texas or something. But he really knows how to play football. And at times, Rutgers seemed like they were in this rock and a hard place with finding healthy guys who knew how to play football versus just having to throw out inexperienced, high athletic testing guys, basically. They kind of seemed like they were in this weird space last year during the later stages of the year. Jet Elad knows how to play football. I mean, he is fast. I don't know if he's as big as Brendan White, who Rutgers had in 2020, but it's kind of similar when you see, like, okay, if the offense runs like a pitch, like Kansas State was killing Rutgers with those perimeter runs, he can come flying down from his safety position and not overrun the play. What you saw with Kaj Sanders was, as a true freshman, at times he was able to do that. At other times, he either overran the play or he stopped too soon and he didn't understand the perfect angle to take. Again, this is purely lack of experience on Sanders' part. Elad has that experience. You'll see him come flying down and identify a channel or a path to get to the ball carrier and know when he has to break down so that the guy doesn't run past him, but also, come in with enough speed that he can make the tackle. Now, again, he's going to be tackling bigger, faster, maybe not that faster, but definitely bigger guys with similar speed in the Big Ten to what he had to do last year. But this is exactly what Rutgers needed against Kansas State. If you just put him on this defense, and of course, he knew your scheme and everything, there's a chance that you win that game. Just him alone. And it's not because he's a perfect football player, but it's because this is what this team needs, is this type of guy. And that's the big why I'm higher on Elad than any other transfer that came in this class for that reason. Like, you can see him fly down the field, but again, he's not overrunning plays. I think that offensive coordinators, I don't think they're necessarily going to plan to not attack him or something. Like, he's not like that type of guy that you're going to be scared to like change your game plan. But expecting that guys are just going to he's going to keep runs that could go for 20 yards to 8. Like, and that type of yardage is what Rutgers really struggled with during that losing streak, was plays just going for too many yards. They didn't have these chase down guys in the defensive backfield that could both contain or chase people from behind. And I don't know what his 40 time is. I really don't know. But when you watch him on film, he does have that kind of catch-up recovery speed to make up for mistakes, either by safeties or other guys in the defense, that he can kind of cover up for their mistake. And that was what Rutgers was sorely lacking this past year. Even if man-on-man they were fine, they didn't have enough guys that can kind of clean up other people's messes, per se.
Yeah, very well said. And, we've harped on the need to upgrade speed in a big way. He brings that, just reading up on him. First of all, he continues that Canada pipeline for Rutgers. Also, an article on his departure from UNLV. His best games were against the best competition. Just in terms of that bowl game, he led UNLV with 11 tackles against Cal. He had big games against Kansas. He had 10 tackles against Syracuse.
That was a really good game.
Yeah, he had a tackles for loss against Boise State. So, again, another guy that rose to the competition he played against. And I think, his IQ, his leadership, and his consistency this past season, those are all things that you really look at him. I think he's probably as close a bet to a surefire starter that they've added on the defensive side, and certainly brings a lot of upside to this roster with that 1 year remaining of eligibility. Overall, I think, again, looking at the context of this offense, it's how do they add to what they're already bringing back. Defense, you're replacing a ton. So in terms of what you're bringing in, are they at the same level of what you're replacing? Are they better? Are they below that? We obviously won't fully know that until we get through a full spring, potentially other additions as well, plus obviously the development of the incumbents on the roster. And we'll do a little bit deeper dive of each position group as we get closer to spring camp. But any final thoughts just on what they've done in the portal so far and anything else you're looking for before the spring semester starts with this roster?
Yeah, I mean, in general, like, I agree with everything you said on offense. You're just trying to add more dimensions to what you have. On defense, I think it's kind of you're not going to replace 5, 6, 7 guys that may be in NFL training camps individually. That's just not how this is going to work. But what you have to do is figure out, how do we maximize the guys that we do have? So, like, for example, adding Elad, right? If you have him, you don't need Kaj Sanders to be playing the deep center fielder safety. I mean, he played it, but he's better if he can play in that, like, Shaquan Loyal or even Desmond Igbenogson closer to the line of scrimmage. Like, I want Kaj Sanders closer to the line of scrimmage if I can get it. Yeah. And so a lot of this stuff with defense is like, even if, again, individually, heads up, is this guy better than who they had last year? No, but I think in terms of how they can fill an aggregate, like what you need from your defense, I think they're on the right track. My concern is that, they might just not have enough impact players. So we might see a little bit of, like you see in the Big 12 or even old Pac-12, where it's like, we have to just try to come up with ways to get turnovers, because we know that we're just not going to stop a team methodically just churning out yardage. And that's where, can they figure out how to generate more turnovers than they did this past year? And so bringing in more guys who are like game changers, whether it be sacks, I mean, just look at the games that they won, right? The Minnesota game, huge safety in that game in the end zone. Virginia Tech, same thing, right? Like, these types of game changing plays can really flip the script, even if the other team is kind of outmanning you one-on-one. And so that's really where I think this season's going to be very difficult, obviously, with the schedule we talked about. But to even win these games, you're going to have to kind of go beyond what you've mentally considered as a coaching staff in the past. Like, if they play as conservative like they try to do this past year, they're going 3-9. Like, they're going to have to play more aggressively on both sides of the ball. And adding players and the mentality of the coaching staff to know, like, we can't just go in the turtle shell. We can't just sit back on defense. Like, it clearly looks on both sides of the ball like the coaching staff gets that. They get it. Like, we can't just like read and react. We have to be the aggressor. And that's like why I have the most optimism with this, because in the past we haven't always seen them take this approach.
Very, very well said, and certainly was something we kind of touched on at the end of the year, and in that rapid reaction against Kansas State, just in terms of changing that mentality, in terms of kind of trying to protect the lead versus still trying to score points and be aggressive, and obviously on the defensive end, trying to make plays with the lead. I think you're right in terms of the mindset, and we may be seeing a shift there. Last question, just in terms of the defensive coordinator, you're bringing all these guys in on defense. We know that Schiano's concepts, schemed, we don't expect it to change much with whoever they hire. It's going to be in lockstep with who they do bring in. How much do you think that they sold that to the guys coming in? How much do you think maybe it is known amongst the players who is coming in, just hasn't been announced yet? And do you think that played a role at all in terms of who they were able to get and who potentially maybe they didn't get that we never even heard about?
No, I think that these guys are pretty system agnostic. And so I don't think that even a relatively minor modification to the scheme would really impact like the expected role that they would have. Because even if you hypothetically, unless you've plain old switched to a 3-4 and played basically a 3-3-5, then maybe Eric O'Neill would be like, what am I doing here? But other than that, like, I don't think that anyone who runs any variant of a 4-3 or a 4-2-5 would change this at all. I think it's a good thing to let these guys know, because it's a trust thing. If you're like,
Right.
hey, we're going to hire such a person as a defensive coordinator, but maybe he's in the NFL, we can't hire him yet, or this is what we're planning to do. I think that helps build trust and honesty and transparency. But I don't think that the defensive coordinator hire is really going to impact this at all. I have so many thoughts about defensive strategy and how that may contribute to Schiano's like ceiling as a coach versus whatever. But at the end of the day, I think that all these guys fit the same thing that we've seen on offense, which is like they need a coordinator who Schiano trusts, but don't expect you're going to fully divorce yourself from like the Schiano style of play. And so by just showing these guys, hey, this is what we've done. I mean, how many teams have recruited players with no head coach in place?
Mm-hmm.
Never mind just not having a defensive coordinator who's going to be running the scheme that you already have. So I don't put too much stock in it at all, because again, I don't think any of these guys are like real niche guys. I think most of them on defense are going to play in any. Again, the only one would be O'Neill. He's really a 4-3 defensive end. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
even if you went to like 3-4 front, you would you can just play Bradley Weaver at one of the tackle spots, I guess. So I don't think it matters too much, other than, maybe a big name or a guy with a pedigree might kind of help them say, hey, I kind of want to play for this guy, has a good reputation. But in terms of beyond that, like, I don't think that it's going to matter that much.
Well, and that's what I was kind of getting at in terms of, the reputation of Schiano, that I think it did benefit them that, okay, you don't have the DC, but these guys know what they're getting with Schiano and his defensive history, backgrounds, concepts, all that, versus the flip side of if you don't have an offensive coordinator, yeah, sure, Schiano can shove its vision there to incoming recruits, but it's not the same thing as having Shiraka now getting that extension, going into his third year, seeing the improvement that they did last year. Defensively, you get more benefit of the doubt because it is Schiano team that you're able to get these defensive guys. So more to come this offseason. Obviously, once the defensive coordinator is named, we can talk more about those defensive strategies and maybe how it fits into where this team is headed for 2025. Spring semester, about 10 days out at this point. So could potentially add a couple more players in the portal. We'll see. Obviously, early enrollees from the 25 recruiting class also. And we'll be back to talk about all that in a little while. But David, thanks so much for all your time and great insight as always. And thank you so much for listening and watching once again here at the Scarlet Faithful podcast.